Roswell Alien Interview, Chapter 14. Errol reviews the interview transcripts. Matilda O'Donnell MacElroy, personal note. Shortly after I finished recounting the previous interview with Errol to the stenographer, I was summoned urgently to the office of the commanding officer of the base. I was escorted by 4 heavily armed military policemen. When I arrived, I was asked to be seated in a very large makeshift office that had been arranged with a conference table and chairs. In the office were several dignitaries I had seen at various times in the gallery. I recognized a few of them because they were famous men. I was introduced to these men, which included Army Air Force Secretary Symington, General Nathan Twining, General Jimmy Doolittle, General Vandenberg, and General Northstadt. To my surprise, Charles Lindbergh was also in the office. Secretary Symington explained to me that Mr. Lindbergh was there as a consultant to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. There were several other men present in the room who were not introduced. I assume these men were personal aides to the officers or agents of some intelligence service. All of this sudden attention, not only from the secretary and generals, but from world-famous people as Mr. Lindbergh and Mr. Doolittle, made me realize how critically important my role as an interpreter for Errol was, as seen through the eyes of others. Until this time, I was not really aware of this except in a peripheral sense. I suppose this was because I was so absorbed in details of the extraordinary situation. Suddenly, I began to grasp the magnitude of my role. I think that the presence of these men in that meeting was intended, in part, to impress me with this fact. The secretary instructed me not to be nervous. He said that I was not in any trouble. He asked me if I thought the alien would be willing to answer a list of questions they had prepared. He explained that they were very eager to discover many more details about Errol, the flying disc, the domain, and many other subjects that Errol had disclosed in the interview transcripts. Of course, they were mainly interested in questions relating to the military security and the construction of the flying disc. I told them that I was very sure that Errol had not changed her mind about answering questions, as nothing had changed that would cause her to trust the intentions of the men in the gallery. I repeated that Errol had communicated everything that she was willing and at liberty to discuss already. In spite of this, they insisted that I would ask Errol again if she would answer questions, and the answer was still no. I was to ask her if she would be willing to read the written copies of the transcripts of my interview translations. They wanted to know if Errol would verify that my understanding and translation of our interviews was correct. Since Errol could not read English very fluently, the secretary asked if they could be allowed to observe for themselves while Errol read the transcripts and verify that they were correct in writing. They wanted her to write a copy of the transcripts, whether the translation were correct or not, and make a note of anything that was not accurate in the transcripts. Of course, I had no choice but to obey orders, and I did exactly what the secretary requested. I was given a copy of the transcripts with a signature page, which I was to show to Errol. After Errol completed her review, I was also directed to request that Errol sign the cover page, attesting that all the translations in the transcripts were correct as amended by her. About an hour later, I entered the interview room, as instructed, with copies of the transcripts and signature page to deliver to Errol, as the members of the gallery, including the generals, and Mr. Lindbergh also, I presume, and others watched through the glass of the gallery room. I went to my usual seat, sitting 4 or 5 feet across from Errol. I presented the envelope of transcripts to Errol and passed on the instructions I had received from the secretary telepathically. Errol looked at me and looked at the envelope without accepting it. Errol said, "If you have read them and they are accurate in your own estimation, there is no need for me to review them also. The translations are correct. You can tell your commander that you have faithfully conveyed a record of our communication." I assured Errol that I had read them, and they were exact recordings of everything I told the transcription typist. "Will you sign the page then?" I asked. "No, I will not," said Errol. "May I ask you why not?" I said. I was a little confused as to why she wasn't willing to do such a simple thing. If your commander does not trust his own staff to make an honest and accurate report to him, what confidence will my signature on the page give him? Why will he trust an ink mark on a page made by an officer of the domain if he does not trust his own loyal staff? I didn't quite know what to say to that. I couldn't argue with Errol's logic, and I couldn't force her to sign the document either. I sat in my chair for a minute, wondering what to do next. I thanked Errol and told her I needed to go ask my superiors for further instructions. I placed the envelope of the transcripts in the inside breast pocket of my uniform jacket, and I began to rise from my chair. At that moment, the door from the gallery room slammed open. 5 heavily armed military police rushed into the room. A man in a white laboratory coat followed closely behind them. He pushed a small cart that carried a box-shaped machine with a lot of dials on the face of it. Before I could act, two of the MPs grabbed Errol and held her firmly down on the oversized chair she had been sitting on since the first day of our interviews together. The other two MPs grabbed my shoulders and pushed me back down on my chair and held me there. The other MP stood directly in front of Errol, pointing a rifle directly at her, no more than 6 inches from her head. The man in the lab coat quickly wheeled the cart behind Errol's chair. He deftly placed a circular headband over Errol's head and turned back to the machine on the cart. Suddenly, he shouted the word, "Clear!" The soldiers who were holding Errol released her. At that instant, I saw Errol's body stiffen and shudder. This lasted for about 15 or 20 seconds. The machine operator turned a knob on the machine and Errol's body slumped back into the chair. After a few seconds, he turned the knob again and Errol's body stiffened as before. He repeated the same process several more times. I sat in my chair being held down all the while by the MPs, and I didn't understand what was going on. I was terrified and transfixed by what was happening. I couldn't believe it. After a few minutes, several other men wearing white lab coats entered the room. They briefly examined Errol, who was now slumped listlessly in the chair. They mumbled a few words to each other. One of the men waved to the gallery window. A gurney was immediately rolled into the room by 2 attendants. These men lifted Errol's limp body onto the gurney, strapped her down across the chest and arms, and rolled it out of the room. I was immediately escorted out of the interview room by the MPs and taken directly to my quarters, where I was locked in my room with the MPs remaining at guard outside the door. After about half an hour, there was a knock at the door of my quarters. When I opened it, General Twining entered, together with the machine operator in the white lab coat. The general introduced the man to me as Dr. Wilcox. He asked me to accompany him and the doctor. We left the room, followed by the MPs. After several twists and turns through the complex, we entered a small room where Errol had been wheeled on the gurney. The general told me that Errol and the domain were considered to be a very important military threat to the United States. Errol had been immobilized so that she could not depart and return to her base, as she said she would do in the interview. It would be a very grave risk to national security to allow Errol to report what she observed during her time at the base, so it had been determined that decisive action was needed to prevent this. The general asked me if I understood why this was necessary. I said that I did, although I most certainly did not agree that it was the least bit necessary, and I certainly did not agree with the surprise attack on Errol and me in the interview room. However, I said nothing about this to the general because I was very afraid of what might happen to me and Errol if I protested. Dr. Wilcox asked me to approach the gurney and stand next to Errol. Errol lay perfectly still and unmoving on the bed. I could not tell whether she was alive or dead. Several other men in white lab coats, who I assumed were also doctors, stood on the opposite side of the bed. They had connected 2 pieces of monitoring equipment to Errol's head, arms, and chest. One of these devices I recognized from my training as a surgical nurse as an EEG machine, which is used to detect electrical activity in the brain. The other device was a normal hospital room vital signs monitor, which I knew would be useless since Errol did not have a biological body. Dr. Wilcox explained to me that he had administered a series of mild electroshocks to Errol in an attempt to subdue her long enough to allow military authorities time to evaluate the situation and determine what to do with Errol. He asked me to attempt to communicate with Errol telepathically. I tried for several minutes but couldn't sense any communication from Errol. I couldn't even sense whether Errol was present in the body any longer. "I think you must have killed her," I said to the doctor. Dr. Wilcox told me that they would keep Errol under observation and I would be asked to return later to establish communication with Errol again. Roswell, Alien Interview, Chapter 15, My Interrogation. Matilda O'Donnell MacElroy, personal note. The next morning I was escorted from my quarters under guard of 4 MPs to the interview room. Errol's overstuffed chair had been removed from the room and replaced by a small desk and several office chairs. I was asked to sit down and wait to be interviewed. After a few minutes, Dr. Wilcox came into the office together with another man wearing a plain business suit. The man introduced himself as John Reed. Dr. Wilcox explained to me that Mr. Reed had been flown in from Chicago at the request of my superior officers to conduct a lie detector test on me. My surprise at this statement was so obvious that Dr. Wilcox noticed that I was obviously taken aback and insulted at the insinuation that I had ever lied about anything. Nonetheless, Mr. Reed began to set up his polygraph device on the desk next to my chair, while Dr. Wilcox continued to explain in a calm voice that the test was being administered for my own protection. Since all the interviews with the alien had been conducted telepathically, and that Errol had decided to read and attest that the typed transcripts were accurate, that the truth and accuracy of the statements contained in the transcripts depended entirely upon my personal word alone. There was no other reliable way to test the accuracy of the transcripts without submitting me to a battery of tests and psychological examinations to determine, in the opinion of experts, meaning himself, whether the transcripts should be taken seriously or not. The tone of his voice said very clearly, or dismissed as the delusional ranting of a mere woman. Mr. Reed proceeded to strap a rubber tube around my chest, as well as an ordinary blood pressure cutoff around my upper arm. Then he placed electrodes on the fingers and surfaces of my hands. He explained that he would be very objective during the interview because he had been thoroughly trained in scientific interrogation. This training was supposed to make his interrogation free of human error. Mr. Reed explained to me that in response to the questions he and Dr. Wilcox were going to ask me, that actual physiological changes would be transmitted through a small panel unit. The readings would then be tracked on moving graph paper, which he placed beside the machine on the desk. The parallel graphs on the paper would then be correlated and interpreted by Mr. Reed with the expert assistance of Dr. Wilcox to determine whether or not I was lying. Both Mr. Reed and Dr. Wilcox asked me a series of innocuous questions to begin, which advanced into a more pointed interrogation about my interviews with Errol. Here's what I remember about the questions. "What is your name?" "Matilda O'Donnell," I replied. "What is your date of birth?" "June 12th, 1924, I said. "What is your age?" 23. "Where were you born?" "Los Angeles, California," I said, and so on and so forth. "Are you able to communicate by telepathy?" "No, I have never been able to do this with anyone except Errol," I said. "Were any of the statements you made to the stenographer falsified?" "No," I answered. "Have you intentionally or unintentionally imagined or fabricated any of the communication you claim to have had with the alien?" "No, of course not," I said. "Are you intentionally attempting to deceive anyone?" "No." "Are you attempting to obstruct this test?" "No." "What color are your eyes?" "Blue." "Are you Catholic?" "Yes." "Would you tell the same stories to your parish priest in a Catholic church confessional that you told the stenographer here at the base?" "Yes." "Are you trying to hide anything from us?" "No, nothing." "Do you believe everything the alien communicated to you?" "Yes." "Do you consider yourself to be a gullible person?" "No." The questions continued in this manner for more than an hour. Finally, I was unhooked from the polygraph machine and allowed to return to my quarters, still under guard by the MPs. Later in the afternoon, I returned to the interview room. This time the desk was replaced by a hospital gurney. Dr. Wilcox was accompanied by a staff nurse this time. He asked me to lie down on the gurney. He said that he had been requested to ask me the same series of questions that I answered for the lie detector test. This time, however, I would respond to the questions under the influence of a truth serum known as sodium pentothal. As a trained surgical nurse, I was familiar with this barbiturate drug, as it was sometimes used as an anesthetic. Dr. Wilcox asked me if I had any objection to submitting to such a test. I told him I had nothing to hide. I cannot recall anything about this interview. I assumed that when I finished answering the questions, I was escorted back to my room by the MPs, with their assistance this time, as I was too wobbly and woozy from the drug to navigate by myself. However, I had a very peaceful sleep that night. Apparently neither of these interrogations yielded any suspicious results, as I was not asked any more questions after that. Thankfully, I was left alone during the rest of my time at the base. Roswell, Alien Interview, Chapter 16. Errol departs. Matilda O'Donnell MacElroy, personal note. I remained at the base, mostly confined to my quarters, for another 3 weeks, after Errol had been incapacitated by Dr. Wilcox. Once a day, I was escorted to the room where Errol lay on the bed, under continued surveillance by Dr. Wilcox and others. Each time I went to the room, I was asked to try to communicate with Errol again. Each time there was no response. This saddened me a great deal. As the days continued, I became increasingly more certain and distressed that Errol was dead, if that is the right word for it. Every day I reread the transcripts of my interviews with Errol, searching for a clue that might remind me of something or help me in some way to reestablish communication with Errol. I still had the envelope in my possession with copies of the transcripts that Errol was asked to sign. To this day, I don't understand why no one ever asked me to return them. I suppose they forgot about the copy of the transcripts in all the excitement. I did not offer to return them. I kept them concealed under the mattress of my bed all the time I remained at the base, and have kept them with me ever since then. You will be the first person to see these transcripts. Since Errol's body was not biological, the doctors could not detect whether the body was alive or dead unless it moved. Of course, I knew that if Errol was not consciously animating the body as an ISB, the body would not move. I explained this to Dr. Wilcox. I explained this to him several times. Each time he just gave me a patronizing sort of smile, patted my arm, and thanked me for trying again. At the end of the third week, I was told by Dr. Wilcox that my services would no longer be needed because it had been decided by the military to move Errol to a larger, more secure military medical facility that was better equipped to deal with the situation. He didn't say anything about where the facility was located. That was the last time I saw Errol's doll body. The following day, I received written orders signed by General Twining. The orders said that I had completed my service to the U.S. military and was officially discharged from further duty, and that I would receive an honorable discharge and a generous military pension. I would be also relocated by the military and given a new identity with the appropriate documents. Along with the orders, I received a document that I was instructed to read and sign. It was an oath of secrecy. The language of the document was full of legalese, but the point was very clearly made that I was to never, ever discuss anything whatsoever with anyone about anything whatsoever that I had seen, heard, or experienced during my service in the military under pain of death as an act of treason against the United States of America. As it turned out, I was placed into a federal government witness protection program, except that I would be protected from the government by the government. In other words, as long as I stayed quiet, I could stay alive. The following morning, I was placed aboard a small military transport plane and flown to a relocation destination. After being shuttled to several locations for short periods, I eventually ended up in Glasgow, Montana, near Fort Peck. The night before I was scheduled to board the transport plane, I lay in bed, contemplating the whole affair and wondering what happened to Errol and to me. I suddenly heard Errol's voice. I sat bolt upright in my bed and turned on the light on the nightstand. I looked around the room frantically for a few seconds. Then I realized that it was Errol, the ISB. Her body was not in the room with me, of course, and it didn't need to be. She said hello. The tone of her thought was plain and friendly. It was unmistakably Errol. I did not have the least doubt about that. I thought, Errol, are you still here? She answered that she was here, but not in a body on Earth. She had returned to her post at the domain base when the doctor and the MPs attacked us in the interview room. She was pleased to perceive that I was well and that I was going to be released unharmed. I wondered how she escaped from them. I was worried that they might have injured Errol by the shock machine. Errol said that she was able to leave the body before the shock was administered and avoid the electric current running through the body. She wanted to let me know that she was safe and not to worry about her. I was very relieved, to say the least. I asked Errol if I would ever see her again. Errol reassured me that we are both ISBs. We are not physical bodies. Now that she had located me in space and time, we would always stay in communication. Errol wished me well, and my communication with her ended for the moment.